where was I? WebEx has a written chat function. Only use the function to address technical difficulties such as not being able to hear. We'll communicate with each other only through speaking. Please direct all discussions and requests to speak through me. If we're able to see each other, you should raise your hand or unmute, or if I still don't see you, you can just speak out and ask to be recognized. Because conversations among several people by electronic means can be cumbersome, we should limit our discussions to the information items and issues directly related to the information items. Please refrain from talking over other speakers. When you participate in discussions, please speak directly into the microphone so we can hear you. And when you make a motion or second a motion, also state your name so we know who is making the motions and the recording secretary can get everything down for the minutes. Because we're conducting this meeting electronically, all votes must be taken by roll call, and I, the other community members, and the public must be able to hear your vote. If you do not vote on a particular item during a roll call, clearly state that you're abstaining from the vote so we can determine whether a majority voted in favor. During the course of this meeting, if you leave the place where you're participating from, please let us know so that we can ensure a quorum continues to exist during the meeting. I will now bring this meeting to order. It is the Thursday, January 21, 2021 meeting of the Land Use Advisory Committee. And we need a roll call to ensure we have a quorum. So go ahead, Sandy.
All right, we'll start with Abdi Sadhu. No, Jonathan Bodeman. Gerald Bruner.
Here.
Carl Drotning. Jennifer Geisler.
Here.
April Graves. Kathy Hemken.
Here.
Noah Keller.
Here.
Philip Klein.
Here.
Trista Maddox-Castillo. I don't know why I just kill your name every time. Trista.
I'm here.
Kathy Mokel. Nope. Steve Morris.
Here.
Mark Nelson.
Here.
Mitra Nelson. Dan Rowe.
Here.
Courtney Schroeder.
Here.
Vince Workman. No, and Wendy Wolf.
Here.
All right, we do have a quorum.
Next up would be the approval of the agenda. We don't have to vote on that unless somebody has some objection. If you have an objection, say now. Otherwise, we'll go with the agenda as written. I don't see any objections. Next up would be approval of the minutes. Do we have a motion and a second to approve the minutes?
Hempkins.
Motion to approve the minutes.
So we've got Phil for a motion and Kathy Hempkin as a second.
Yes.
Any discussion or changes to the minutes? Then go ahead, Sandy, and take the roll again.
We'll start again with Abdi Sadhu. Jonathan Bodeman. Gerald Bruner.
Yes, I approve.
Okay. Carl Drotning. Is he here yet? No. Jennifer Geisler. Jennifer.
Approve.
Let's see. April Graves. Still not here. Kathy Hemken.
Yes.
Phil Klein.
Yes.
Noah Keller.
Yes.
Krista.
Aye.
See how I just ditched that last name? Kathy Mokel. Still not here. Steve Morris.
Aye.
Mark Nelson.
I'll abstain. I wasn't here for that meeting, sorry.
Okay. Mitra Nelson, are you here yet? No? Okay. Dan Rowe.
Aye.
Courtney Schroeder.
Abstain.
Vince Workman, is he here? No? Wendy Wolf.
Aye.
All right, our minutes are approved.
Okay, thank you. Next up, we have the appointment of the vice chair, and Phil has kindly accepted to continue to be the vice chair. If you want to have a motion and a second for that.
Motion approved by Geisler.
Seconded Hempkin.
And Sandy, go ahead and take the roll.
Okay, we'll start again with Sado Abdi. Still not here. Gerald Bruner.
Yes.
I should back up. Jonathan Bodman, is he here yet? Okay, Carl Drotnin.
Yes.
Okay, Carl is not here. April Graves. Jennifer Geisler.
Aye.
Kathy Hempkin.
Yes.
Noah Keller.
Yes.
Phil Klein.
I better vote yes.
Krista.
Yes.
Kathy Mokel. Still not here. I'm going to go back to Sadi Abdi. I see you're here now.
I am here.
Okay. Approval of the vice chair.
Approved, yes.
Okay. Jumping ahead again now, Steve Morris.
Yes, I couldn't unmute that fast. Yeah, sorry.
That's okay. Mark Nelson.
Yes.
Okay. And Mitra Nelson. Still not here. Dan Rowe.
Aye.
Courtney Schroeder.
Aye.
Vince Workman. Is he here now? Nope. And Wendy Wolf.
Aye.
All right.
Congratulations, Phil. So
Thank you.
that brings us to the meat of the meeting today. We have an information item. The ULI has graciously agreed to have a developer panel here for us so that we can learn all sorts of cool things. And Kathy Bennett, take it away.
Hi, Chair Wolf. I'll go ahead and introduce Kathy if I can.
Sure.
Hi, everyone. I'm Angela Torres, Manager of Local Planning Assistance. As we're closing out the 2040 planning cycle with comp plans, we're turning our attention to the 2050 planning cycle. I know that's terrifying to hear. One of LUAC's charges, though, is to advise the Council on issues of land use and comprehensive planning. And we wanted to start that discussion with the developers panel this afternoon on what's happening now in the marketplace and as a result of the pandemic. You'll be hearing more from us in local planning assistance and others across the Council over the coming year on additional items, whether that's a comp plan report out or additional research, etc. But I would like to just introduce Kathy Bennett from the Urban Land Institute, Minnesota. Local planning assistance and ULI partner together regularly. With ULI's assistance, we're able to expand our ability to provide technical assistance to local governments and collaborate with regional experts like those you will hear from on the panel today. Kathy Bennett is here today to moderate the panel. She's worked with ULI Minnesota and the Regional Council of Mayors since 2008, where she manages the advisory services team. This work has included facilitating over 100 work sessions between public officials and the private and nonprofit sectors related to general and complex land use issues. She has 25 years experience in public and private alliances, program development, TOD, and project management in all facets of housing policy, development and redevelopment planning, and strategic implementation. I'm happy to turn to Kathy now as we begin the discussion.
Thank you, Angela, and thank you, Chair and members of the committee for having us tonight. I'm going to do just a quick introductory presentation, and then I will turn it over and have some questions for the panel. I want to just, I'm hoping this is going to be more of a discussion. So if you have questions in the spirit of the way that Zoom goes, you can raise your hand or let me know, and I will call on you, or the chair can help monitor that as well. Angela and or others, are you going to share? Oh, there you go. I don't have to do it. That's even better. So you can go to the next slide. Thanks. So for those who maybe are not familiar with the Urban Land Institute Minnesota, our mission is to engage public and private sector leaders to foster collaboration, share knowledge, and influence meaningful strategic action in the responsible use of land to create and sustain thriving communities. I think that our vision, thriving communities, is very much aligned with the Metropolitan Council's mission and their work. And our partnership has been a really great working relationship in connecting both the public and private sector, and the information and the desires and the need to have a coordinated plan throughout the region, and looking at the way that we build our environment and use our infrastructure, and et cetera, et cetera. Next slide, please. One of the main ways that we are able to do our work is through the Regional Council of Mayors. We have a couple of mayors on the call here, Mayor Hemke and Mayor Rowe, who participate in that group. They've been around since 2004. They've grown from 8 mayors to about 60 plus mayors in 2020. And really the Regional Council of Mayors started with the Metropolitan Council when they brought mayors together to talk about affordable housing. Those mayors appreciated coming together to talk in a nonpartisan way about these regional issues that they asked our previous executive director, Karen Dewar, to continue to convene them, and they have grown since then. Next slide, please. So our advisory services work. This includes many different ways that we connect with communities, workshops like the one tonight, as well as some deeper dive technical assistance panels where we really dig deep into certain land use issues. And we also convene various cities on policy issues. And that really has had impact over the years in the work that we've done. This is a lot of words, but I'm hoping Angela and others can share this presentation with you. One point that I'd like to make, in 2019 alone, 32 cities supported policy and zoning changes to increase density and create higher priority for affordability. This work, we believe, is a culmination of years of technical assistance and the partnerships that we've had with the private sector in helping to inform the public sector around what it takes to do development. Next slide, please. And we really think it's about trust. It's about building trust between both the public and private sectors. You can look at the couple of quotes here. Next slide, please. And we wouldn't be able to do this work if it wasn't for supporters like Metropolitan Council and our partnership with you. So I thank you very much for that. This map here shows all the communities that we have done some work in, and the darker colored communities are ones that we've done multiple sessions in. And we've also done some work in Greater Minnesota as well through our new relationship with mayors in Minnesota called Minnesota Mayors Together. Next slide. So really the meat of our discussion tonight is with the panel. And I thought it would be helpful to share with you some recent national data that the Regional Council of Mayors just received last week from Tom Fisher at the U of M. And it's really about the impacts of the pandemic and how it's changed how we work, how we shop, and the infrastructure and all of those key pieces about community building and the use of land that Metropolitan Council has to consider, particularly as they're looking out to 2050. And what we've heard is these are going to have long-lasting impacts. For instance, 42% of the workforce is now working full-time from home. And 75% of them are saying that they want to continue at least a few days a week. However, 30% of the jobs can't be done at home and would require face-to-face interaction. Many of those people require transportation, public transportation, to get to their jobs. The way we shop, we have a great market research representative, Sam Newberg with CBRE here tonight, and he can dig deeper into this. But permanent closures of stores and shops is 95,000+ across the country, and 60% of those closed businesses are not expected to reopen. A recent ULI presentation on the retail industry also indicated that many of the national department stores, the Macy's, others, are not going to survive. And it's not only because of the pandemic, but they were not necessarily going to survive anyway. And the pandemic has just accelerated the rate of department stores and malls and how they have to think differently and creatively in the way that they're going to be a commercial enterprise for the different regions. But that's also going to leave a lot of land that communities are going to have to think differently about as well. And this also has impact on our infrastructure. And that is a real area where Metropolitan Council has a lot of influence and investments. About 10 to 15% change in telework will basically make the rush hour disappear permanently. And what really does that mean for our roads? Also, the increase in bike sales, that's continuing. That has not changed. Bike sales are up 121% and 85% for electrical bikes. And that is increasingly, they are using those modes of transportation for daily commuting, for work, for going to stores, for recreating, et cetera. And what does that mean in the design of our roads and all the different infrastructures that we need? Next slide, please. So we have a great panel to really dig deep and kind of give some local context to these national statistics. Cecile Bedore, Common Bond, Colleen Carey, the Cornerstone Group, Sam Newberg with CBRE, and Noel Noor with Noor Companies. What I'm going to do is go through some questions to them. And again, if you want to jump in or you have a burning question, please feel free to do so. And then after I go through about 4 different questions with each one of the panel, I will open it up for discussion with all of you. So with that, Angela, you can stop sharing. I first would like each one of our panelists to just give a little bit of background about themselves so you know where their areas of expertise are. I know all of you have their bios in your information, but I thought it would be good for you to just get to know them a little bit. So if we could just start with Cecile, could you just introduce yourself and the work that you've done?
Sure, thank you. And thank you all for the opportunity to see you all today. And hello again, Mark. Call earlier with Mark Nelson. Again, I'm with Common Bond Communities. I oversee our real estate area, which includes acquisition and development, our construction management, our asset management, and our corporate compliance. What that means is while we manage all of our own properties and we provide services, my asset management team kind of serves as the owner's rep, if you will, because the vast majority of our properties are in some sort of a limited partnership with investors. And I've just been here for about 2.5 years, but prior to that, did development work, affordable housing development work for other nonprofits. I also worked on the investor side for the National Equity Fund that invests in tax credits. I worked for the Met Council back when Karen was there, and I was there when Karen started the Regional Council of Mayors. While I was at the Met Council, I did the Family Affordable Housing Program, so raised those funds, and I think that is still part of the program at Met Council, which I'm happy to know. And we continue to be really busy. There's a lot of work to be done out there. There's a lot of demand. So I'll leave it there since you have the rest of the bio.
Great. Thanks, Cecile. Colleen?
Hi, everybody. My name is Colleen Carey, and I'm the president of the Cornerstone Group. We're a real estate development company, been around for, I think it's like 27 years now, which seems a little weird, but it's true. We focus primarily on housing and have developed lots of affordable housing, but also did a bit of a departure from affordable housing into some condo and mixed use projects that were driven by city goals about development and having a broader range of housing products. So our expertise currently is in a variety of different kinds of projects, housing and not market rate and affordable. And we're currently just finishing up a condo project in Ridgefield.
Hey, Kathy, could I say one other thing?
Yes,
I just realized I did not do a good job of introducing Common Bond. So just for 30 seconds, Common Bond's been around for 50 years. Affordable housing developer. We work in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Iowa, and Rapid City. We develop in suburban, urban, and greater Minnesota areas. And we serve, we have straight affordable housing, workforce housing to highly supportive housing. So for example, Upper Post is our property out at Fort Snelling that serves formerly homeless vets. That's a 24-hour front desk. And then we have other properties that serve homeless youth. And then most of our properties might have a percentage of the units that are set aside for homeless. We work in partnerships. So for example, one of our latest projects is out in Eden Prairie with Mark's Group, United Properties, where we did an affordable piece adjacent to one of their senior co-op projects. Thank you.
Thanks, Cecile. Colleen. Sam?
Yeah, hi everybody. I am at CBRE. My name is Sam Newberg. I've been there for a year and a half, and so in the capacity of today, I'm sort of the commercial real estate expert talking about retail, office, and the industrial trends to the extent that that matters. In a past life, I worked for myself for a company called Joe Urban, where I did a combination of market studies and freelance writing. So the freelance writing piece, I wrote for ULI and other real estate organizations and magazines on all kinds of land use topics and development across the country. That gave me pretty good exposure to trends and kind of what's going on everywhere, including here. And for the market studies side, I actually count Cornerstone Group and Common Bond as clients. I did a lot of market rate and affordable housing studies. So over the course of many years, I got pretty good exposure to that as well. So I can also sort of help speak to housing issues. But yeah, it's great to be here.
Great, thanks, Sam. Noel?
Kathy, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Noel.
Terrific. Good afternoon. My name is Noel Noor. I'm the CEO of Noor Companies. Noor Companies is a social enterprise, quasi nonprofit, quasi for-profit with a mission. We're a general contractor and developer. First in the East African community. I launched this company after 10 years of corporate finance experience and just seeing that there was no one that looked like me who represented the community. I worked for Aon for 4 years while I was in college, and so had exposure to affordable housing development. Noor Companies, we have a few developments in the works now. One is under construction at the moment, and then from a development standpoint, we have one that's in the pipeline for affordable housing project. And then on the contracting side, that's kind of where we are known most. We just finished Target East Lake Street as a result of the civil unrest that happened on the Lake Street corridor. And you know, as a company, we're sort of committed to making sure that we have a positive impact on our community. So a lot of investment on the community engagement side. And then, yeah, I'm excited to be here. So thank you, Kathy, for having us.
Thanks, Noel. So, Colleen, I want to start off with you. as my slide previous to this had indicated, that the pandemic has drastically changed the way we live, work, and play. And as a developer, how are you responding, and what do you believe the committee should be thinking about as they review their land use policies and investments in infrastructure?
Thanks, Kathy. I'm going to broaden my answer a little bit, because to me, it's not just the pandemic. As I think about like how to move forward, it's about the pandemic, but because of climate change and racial and social injustice and the pandemic, I think that all of that is just a pile of stuff that cities are going to need to address. And so, like, in a few simple words, I think cities are going to need to be more flexible and more equitable and more sustainable. And when you circle back to all of the changes that are happening, I actually have been reading a book recently about change and what's coming, and the key thing to be aware of at this stage is that the change is going to be super fast. And we've been hearing this for a while, but the 21st century is going to be like just known for this time of profound change and uncertainty. And so that's kind of hard for everybody to deal with, because you never get your bearings when the next thing changes. And so when we talk about what do you need to know in order to survive and thrive in that kind of changing environment, specialized skills could change. Like computers can do them. So even like learning a foreign language seems like a good idea. And then, there's translators coming out that you won't need to learn the foreign language. You'll just have this little Google translator that will do everything for you. So a lot of the tasks that we think are, we need to know may change. The thing that won't change is that we're going to have to be able to be flexible. And I mean, some of that in our brains. Our brains are going to have to get used to the idea that things are always changing, and that what we have to be prepared for is not some new thing that is the thing, but that it's this constant time of change. And Tom Fisher, who spoke to all of us a couple weeks ago, and Kathy summarized those notes, really had outlined a couple of the things that we're already seeing, which make it really hard to plan. So, but there are some things that I think are happening. And so one of the things Kathy was talking about is this idea that 42% of the workforce is now working from home, and 75% want to keep doing so. And 2/3 of all the economic activity is coming out of houses right now. So that says something to me as a developer of housing about what people are going to want and need in a home. And we're seeing that already, but I can't say I'm doing 10 new projects that are driven by this new demand. But what we see is that people want bigger spaces, and they want spaces that work for working at home, and they want spaces where that are a bigger and accommodate their kids to come back home, as has happened in this current time, or to go to school from home. And these are all things that we just really didn't reflect on as much. And so it does drive a lot about how your space needs to work, also having more access to outdoor space, better broadband, some more private spaces for doing work or studying. So we're seeing that there is a shift in demand in response to those statistics that Tom was talking about. Another one, 91% of employers see their staff as being more productive working from home. That tells you a lot about the need for office space. And I don't do a lot of office development, but I do have a couple small projects that have office space in them. But what we're hearing is that companies are really thinking they can probably have 50% of the amount of office space that they currently have, and let their people work from home some of the time. And some people don't want to work from home, but lots of them do. Some want to work part-time from home. So companies are downsizing in terms of how much office space they need. And that's going to change the office market for sure. But it's also going to create some properties that need to be repurposed. So I think that that's one of the things that we're going to see. We're going to have lots of empty space, office and retail in particular. And we're going to have to figure out how to do adaptive reuses. And that is an area where we're seeing some opportunity already in terms of looking at vacant spaces and trying to figure out how to reposition them for the new needs, which are just quite different than the past. The one thing that hasn't changed and probably won't change is we need more affordable housing. And so one of the things that I think we need to be thinking about is how do we incorporate some affordable housing into some of these underutilized properties, and what's the opportunity to do some adaptive reuse to make that happen. I do think we have to rethink our assumptions about single-use zoning districts and parking requirements and fixed building types. I think if you think that things are going to be constantly changing over the next bunch of decades, then getting too locked down about this is this kind of building and this is that kind of building and this neighborhood is like this and that one's different. It's all going to change on a more regular basis than we have experienced in the past. I think it also changes our infrastructure needs, and with less commuting, and believe it or not, driverless cars really are coming, and we don't see it just yet, but it's really more because of political obstacles than it is because the technology isn't there. We're going to see driverless cars. We're going to see people not commuting as much, and so that changes our need for parking. It changes how we would build parking into a housing development, which is always a giant problem to figure out how to solve the parking dilemmas. In the near term, it doesn't solve anything because we have to build projects for now, but by the time we get done paying off the property in 30 years, the parking needs are going to clearly be different. So we have to think about how we design those kinds of spaces. And then just in terms of infrastructure, again, I don't think we're going to need quite as many big wide streets. We're not going to need as much parking, and that could create opportunities for us to create much better green infrastructure that are walking trails and biking paths and the kinds of things that people are really looking for. Also infrastructure, we need digital access, for everybody. And I think the thing that we're going to have to continue to figure out is how do we ensure equity as we move forward in all of this change. As Kathy mentioned, like 30% of people still going to have to go to work, and those people are the typically not making as much money and have less flexibility about their whole life structure. And so how do we ensure that these essential workers have the support that they need from the cities that they're living in, from the infrastructure that we create? And clearly affordable housing is one of those things. So I think I'll leave it at that for now. Other folks on the panel might have more to add.
Sure, Cecile.
Yeah, so that was really great. I took a couple of notes of things that really resonated, and the shifting of the market demands and how it might be obvious that developers need to respond to that, but then so do the cities, so does the Met Council. And as you know, that's not necessarily an easy shift to make. So it's an interesting thing for, I think, the council to think about is what does it mean for a city to be nimble in terms of zoning, parking requirements, et cetera, because the market changes faster than zoning studies get through or task forces, et cetera. And I think Colleen's point about adaptive reuse of buildings is really spot on. I think one of the challenges that comes into play with that, like on affordable housing, for example, is great idea. Let's prioritize that without really understanding that's a really good idea that costs a lot more money. And schools are a really good example. It's expensive to redo schools. They're just not, generally speaking, they're old. They weren't built for housing, so it costs a lot of money. Again, it's not that you can't, but when cities and Met Council and others are looking for efficient use of public dollars, those are some consideration. And I think too, this whole technology issue is a huge, to Colleen's point, first of all, for certain folks, it's really way too expensive. It's cost prohibitive, but you really can't function in this world anymore without having that connectivity if you do have the opportunity to work from home. And then the last thing I just wanted to put an exclamation point on is this whole conundrum around mass transit and public transit, because the demand is going down so significantly because so many people are working from home. But the folks who really need that those numbers aren't as big that would support like Metro Transit, for example, because you've lost so many customers in terms of commuting time. So I think that's something that we can't forget is how the folks who have to go to work are going to get there without completely scaling down the system so it doesn't work for them. That's all I wanted to add.
Great. I see there's a question from Trista Masticacio. Our current transit infrastructure is car-centric. How do we think about infrastructure serving people who can't work from home? To Colleen's point, often this is lower income and transit dependent. Could prioritizing transit dependent and multimodal systems they use combined with climate equity launch us into a more equitable infrastructure? Does anybody have thoughts on that on the panel?
Kathy, I was just going to comment on the fact that I agree with everything that Cecil and Colleen have said. I also think that there's a distinction between urban and suburban communities. And I also think that there's a difference between the communities of color and communities of and white communities, and access to transportation is at the heart of that. I think one thing that I just wanted to bring up is that from an environmental perspective, a lot of our cities are feeling like they can breathe. And a lot of the environmental issues are faced by people of color because they live in the urban areas. And so to that extent, how do you kind of bring in the transportation access, and how do you bring clean energy transportation access to people who can who live in these urban corridors is a comment that I wanted to make, and kind of addresses the question of the participant. And part of that is, obviously one to Met Council, how do you create modes of transportation that are environmentally friendly and still address the equitable access to transportation from and to work and or places of workforce development. And I think that's one element that's really important for future zoning and investment.
Great. Let's maybe turn to the market. We've talked a little bit about the market. Sam, that's your bailiwick. You daily are analyzing what's happening in the market. Can you share with us what current trends you're seeing? How do these trends differ from previous years, and how should developers and policy leaders be responding to these trends?
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. And you brought up in your opening remarks that a lot of these issues were sort of pre-existing, and the world was changing before COVID anyway. So I think what I'm going to say has a lot to do with just sort of long-term trends and not just this moment in the pandemic. One of the most interesting things I've seen in the market lately is Best Buy's decision to renovate 4 of its stores so that it's essentially only 50, like half a store in the traditional sense and half a fulfillment center, which functions the same way as a warehouse. So that's a reflection of just how much more online shopping we're doing before the pandemic, and will in all likelihood continue to increase afterwards. Amazon and other large retailers have been a huge portion of the warehouse industry, or warehouse real estate in recent years. I'm glad Colleen brought up some of the office statistics. I think, right now downtown Minneapolis, about 10 to 20% of office workers are there every day. Our office just reopened last week and only 7 people showed up out of 200. Long term, everyone has a percent they think will come back to work. I think it's just about impossible to know what that's going to be, but I'd be very surprised if there wasn't a lot more excess office space. So, getting to Colleen's point, CBRE takes the 15% office reduction number at this point in time. And if you just took 15% of all office space in the Twin Cities off the market right now, you'd have the opportunity to create, that's 19 million square feet that could potentially be renovated into 19,000 housing units. So for perspective, that's, even if you could do that, like wave a magic wand, that's still 2/3 of what of the affordable housing supply we should have built in the past decade. So it would help present opportunities for more housing. It certainly wouldn't, it's one of many tools and potential solutions to the affordable housing shortage. But that's just kind of, I think that's important for perspective. The working world will be interesting. But keep in mind, overall, just on a more global perspective, the Twin Cities, every metro area is going through the pandemic. And when we get through this, we still will, relative to our peers, be a strong, diverse economy with, a higher than average educational attainment and overall high quality of life with our parks and other things. Certainly we have social equity issues to address, but competitively, the Twin Cities is still in a good position. So that's something to keep in mind going forward. I'll stop there, but I know I'd like to get into help participate in some of these other remarks or if there's any questions.
Great, Sam, thank you. Let's talk a little bit more about affordable housing. And Cecile, that's your expertise with Common Bond and what has been happening in your properties right now. I'm sure you've been very busy. The one thing that the pandemic has done is not reduce the amount of affordable housing that's needed, but actually likely increased it significantly. What are you seeing? Are you seeing that there's an increased support for affordable housing in communities? And do you have any recommendations on how Met Council should increase equitable access to affordable housing in their policy and funding decisions?
Sure, thanks. If we have time to come back, I would be curious, Sam, because I don't know the answer to this, but some of the office space, for example, if it goes unused and they want to convert it, what the debt level is on some of those properties. So how feasible is it to do that? I actually have no idea, I have no frame of reference for that, but it just popped into my head. Is that even feasible in terms of what affordable housing costs or the resources available to do that? But in any event. So yeah, I'm happy to say that there is actually more support for affordable housing. It just depends on what you mean by that. So if you mean financial, yes, and attention, yes. In terms of the neighborhood issues that we're all familiar with, not necessarily. I would say on the financial side, Ramsey County is a really good example of kind of some new resources. Some of you may have read that they've always had the ability to issue tax-exempt bonds, for example, and they're going to get back into doing that, which is a great tool. And they've also have kind of looked at where all of their funding is going and have pulled funding from other departments and other needs to prioritize affordable housing. So for example, they provided a significant grant/loan to Common Bond for our Ford site, which will be affordable housing for seniors out there. Woodbury, I know, is another example of doing work. They've had somebody from Woodbury on this committee, I know, has had a housing task force, I believe, has met 2 or 3 times, meeting again in February, to come up with some new tools, hopefully, that they can use. I know a lot of cities are really protective about using TIF. Other cities are really aggressive in using TIF. But having those resources does make a huge difference, and I can talk about that a little bit more. At the Capitol, there's also some work that's happening. The Senate, for the first time, designated a housing committee, and the House did that last session, and this session they've created a homeless committee. So there's more attention in both the House and the Senate around affordable housing that hopefully will lead to some additional resources. You all read about the CARES Act and other resources related to the pandemic that focus on keeping people in their homes, particularly around evictions and providing rental assistance, which has been really critical. And then finally, there's a lot of efforts at a lot of different cities to create housing trust funds, which is also really important. And right after this, I'm sitting on a panel for the city of Edina around a tenant protection ordinance. So I think there's a lot of lot of effort that's going on right now around affordable housing. Where that leads to in terms of resources that cities are willing to utilize is yet to be seen. But it's really important because I think the one thing people forget is it doesn't cost us any less to build an apartment than it does for a for-profit developer, for example, who's building market rate. The only difference is really in your finishes and perhaps some of your amenities. But lumber prices are out of this world for everybody right now. Getting parts delivered and getting appliances delivered right now is out of this world. So whenever you see those market trends that are happening for an affordable housing developer, they're happening across the spectrum of development. I think the other thing too that I would be remiss to not talk about, and I'm petting my cat so that she'll just stay where she is. So I'm sorry, because otherwise she's up here. Is this whole NIMBY thing, and I know it's just old news, and we've heard about that, but I think that is just a continuing challenge that I don't think will ever go away, because we've named affordable housing different things. You know, it's been low-income housing, then it was affordable housing, and it's workforce housing, but now workforce housing is now taken on a different. That's 80% of median and above for some, but I will just say. It's been really challenging. There's been 2 cities, and the mayor of Roseville knows what I'm thinking, that it's really challenging for elected officials when you have people that are showing up who are just really driven by fear about what that means to have affordable housing in their neighborhood. And that really creates a conundrum for city council members who want to do the right thing. And yet there's a lot of political pressure also to be responsive to their constituents. And I just bring it up because I don't think that's getting any better. And it has been the same since I've been doing this work for many, many years. So as a matter of fact, it did drive somebody I know really well out of the business because it just put him over the edge. He just couldn't take it anymore because it can get pretty mean, unfortunately, at that level. So I have a lot of empathy for elected officials who have to deal with those decisions. And on the other hand, we really need our elected officials to step up and make those, what unfortunately is a hard decision. The need is not gone away at all. The need does continue to increase, and the resources are highly competitive. So in terms of the Met Council, you know, I think things to keep in mind is nobody wants to be referred to as gap financing, because I think all funders have a priority and values that they want to make sure their funding supports. The fact is, in affordable housing, the key drivers of those projects are really, for the majority of the work that we do, are through the tool of low-income housing tax credits. And that's a 9%, which is much more valuable than a 4%. I won't go into those details. But on those 9% credits, those are provided through a process with Minnesota Housing and sub-allocators, and there's probably 5 or so sub-allocators across the state. And those sub-allocators and the allocator of Minnesota Housing are the ones that dictate what the priorities are. And there's points, and you score, and who gets the most points wins. And so if you have another agency, whether that's a city or the Met Council or a county, that says we want to fund housing for people from Mars, and Minnesota Housing's priority is from Venus, Venus is going to get built, not Mars. And so I think one of the key things that both the Met Council and others can do and are doing is to kind of get together as a cohort to talk about what one another's priorities are and how they can align. Because unfortunately, if your biggest source of funding is going to come from somebody else, the Met Council's money is going to be gap money. But if the Met Council asks for something to be built or be included in the property, but the Met Council money isn't going to pay for that, and that's not a priority of any other funder, it's really hard to fit that in. So you have developers that are just trying to be super creative and how to meet the letter of what you're looking for, and not just you, but whoever that funding community is, because we're trying to stack a lot of different sources of funds to get together all the money that we need to go build that building. And I think I speak for most developers when we would love to have structured parking, not surface parking. We would love to have high-end amenities or for all of our residents. We would like to provide free internet for all of our residents. We would like to have 100% brick because it's beautiful. But all of those things cost a lot of money. And when you're looking for innovative ways to use dollars, whether that's water resources, you have to remember that we can't always we can't always demonstrate a brand new way of doing something if we can't afford to do that, or if it doesn't really jive with what a city might require. So I hope that kind of makes sense. And I think the last thing I would say too is that I think it's important when you're looking at your application process that you ask, how long does it take to put that together? And are the different questions that are being asked really different than the one before? I've just noticed in various funding applications that it may take you a good 20 or 30 hours to write that application when you're kind of answering a lot of the same questions. So I think it's really important for all funders to take a look at, what do I really want to know about this project and this developer, and keep it as succinct as possible, and make sure it aligns with the amount of time it takes to put it in, that it's worth that effort. And similarly, that the grant amounts that you're given, if there's a lot of strings that you're attaching to your money, to think about what it's going to take for that developer to implement that, what it's going to take for that developer to report on that, whether that's one time or if it's annually, because you have to remember that all the other funders that we get also have requirements that you need to report on and that you need to meet. So when I think about the capital stack, the number of resources that we have, our Lease Awards, which is, every single unit we list on a 60-unit project, and we decide, we have to note whether that's a home unit, which is a federal source. If it got CDBG from this county says the CDBG can only go to units to serve people at this income. And then you might have some Section 8 units. And so from an organization standpoint and a staff management, we got to figure out, okay, unit 1 has to check this box, and this box. This unit has to check this box, this box. So I say that because it's really quite complicated when we're putting this together. So to the extent the Met Council can keep it as simple as possible, while again meeting your goals, but trying to a certain extent, align your goals with others would be helpful. And I think too, to keep in mind that when a large ask comes in, but it's not large relative to the project size, to know that if somebody's asking you for $2 million and you give them $150,000, it isn't really helpful because they still got to come up with the rest of that money to fill that gap. So it might be more productive, and you might actually realize more projects getting built by funding fewer projects as opposed to spreading it out. So you can, for lack of a better phrase, take credit for helping to get that project done. So I'll leave it there for right now. That's a lot, but I hope that kind of gives you some broad views of the things we think about.
Cecile, thanks for kind of giving all of that information in detail. And, Common Bond's a pretty big company. I think about Colleen and Noel, your companies are fairly small, and some of these added requirements and added amenities or added requirements and other things really cost you a lot more sometimes. I mean, it's still probably the same cost, but as a smaller developer, it's a lot more, it's a lot harder to absorb. Is that true? I mean, I think about that.
Noel, do you want to answer first?
Sure. It does. I mean, when I was on the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency board, one of the first things as a public board that I mentioned was, what does it take to invest in affordable housing? Typically, you invest pre-development dollars that are $100,000 or more just in consulting. And then you can imagine one affordable housing unit probably you could put 2 more units in that if you invested that $100,000. And the reason you invest in that is because it's so complex to put that application together. There's so much paperwork, and every year it gets more complex, and it doesn't get easier. And so what's the cost of affordable housing? It's not because it doesn't cost more because, it's not just the real estate land or availability or community. There's all of that. But our funding mechanisms are getting more complex and more difficult every single year. And
and I would just add to that, for example, the LCD application requires pretty significant calculations that have to be done by an architect. So the other thing I just keep in mind is, when you have your application, you have to think about who can answer that. So a project manager for Common Bond can't answer those questions. So we got to hire somebody to do that. And while we're larger, we're in 57 cities, we have about 7,000 units. We still have 5 people that work on real estate development. The vast majority, like 90% of our staff, are property management and services staff. So we rely a lot on outside folks to do this kind of work for us. And again, minimal pre-development dollars as well, as Noel just said, and all that, you got to find that money somewhere. So that's something to keep in mind too.
And Colleen, I don't know if you want to add something, but one last thing that I want to add is every real estate development requires an attorney. And so if you're a small developer, Common Bond probably has their own general counsel that's in-house. Sorry, Cecile, maybe I assumed that. So maybe you don't. So, but that's even worse. I mean, for me as a developer, how much money do I have to invest in pre-development dollars before I get one project off the ground? It's significant question that I ask every day, and that's why it's so hard. There's so much barrier to entry just for smaller developers, minority and women-owned businesses, because it requires so much more early investment upfront, and it more than likely it takes 3 years for one affordable housing project to be funded fully and to be constructed. In 3 years, and you have to do 3 applications to Minnesota Housing Finance Agency before you get funded.
So, Noel, if I can kind of expand on that, Metropolitan Council has a goal of advancing racial and economic equity by using their influence and investment to build more equitably throughout the region and investing in a mix of affordable housing. You as a woman, a minority-owned small developer, what challenges have you experienced in your work, and what suggestions would you have to increase access to opportunity in an equitable way that might help this group plan for the future?
Thanks, Kathy. And I'm really happy to hear the equity agenda. Every community should be built on a foundation of equity, inclusiveness, and cooperation. And for us, that requires a breakdown of the barriers to and addressing the disparities, especially the social and economic injustices that have happened over the course of hundreds of years. I'm an immigrant. I'm new here to this country. This is my home country now, and I'm really one of the fortunate ones to be educated to get to where I am today and to be one of the first developers. And it takes a lot to be there. And I'm the first one to say we have a lot of opportunities in this country, but I also think that the barriers are so great. It took me, I'm 10 years into corporate finance, and I feel like I'm one of those people who get it. And it took me 5 years to get my first development, affordable housing development that was not just private development off the ground. And so from a global perspective, what are the challenges? The 2 biggest challenges I'll probably mention are, one is access to capital. Every development, the developer gets the majority of the credit, but 80% of that development is funded by the bank. And sort of close to 15-20% of it almost is investors. And so what does that require? That requires access to social capital. And most minority and women-owned businesses like mine don't come from very wealthy families and friends. And I didn't go to I went to college, in private college. I was really lucky, but very few people are gonna try to invest in you. Because one, they don't know you, and you don't have the social capital to get that investment. And it goes this, same way with banks. Banks, you have to have collateral to be able to get the investment that you need. And so just because of those two things, it's almost impossible to get a project funded. And if you can imagine a $10 million project, which is really small in the context of affordable housing, we're doing an $11 million project now that's 32 units. It took us, this is what the second year round of funding applications that we have. And just to give you context, this year, Minnesota Housing Finance Agency received 4 applications that were from people of color, specifically Black people. And so people of African descent, and all 4 were unfunded. And it happens every single time. And I can say that the agency with the commissioner have an amazing agenda. When I was on the board, we put together an equity agenda on this strategy for the first time in history. And so there's a lot of work to be done, and it's just in its infancy. But there's a lot of the amount of paperwork and the knowledge and the know-how. That alone makes it almost impossible for people of color who don't have the background, who don't have the history, to really break into this industry. They're less than 1% of the developers are people of color and women. And Colleen is one of my mentors, and I know she was one of the few women, if not the only woman in many years. And so I'm really lucky to be in that group. But I would say the challenges have not gotten easier since Colleen has started. And so where do we go from here? What's the sort of the ask from the Met Council from my view? I would say a couple of things. One is typically the work that I do is affordable housing, and some of the things that I'm trying to address is the East African community needs large units that are 3 to 4 bedrooms. Common Bond does a great job, but we need more. And so this development that I have going on, for example, is 3 to 4 bedrooms. Those units cost a lot more per unit cost, and so they are harder to fund because the gap is so much more greater. And so if you're applying for a 9% tax credit or the 4% bond, if you apply for the 4% bond, it's almost impossible because the gap is even greater. And then typically what happens is we're doing it in Seward, and Seward is in the urban core, and it's in the qualified census tract. And so that makes it almost impossible to get City of Minneapolis funds. And so now you got 2 things that are going against you, and try to build a project that is affordable housing. And just imagine the difficulty of that. And so one of the things we have to think about is how do we change the application process to make it easier for us to develop in our communities and for our communities. The other thing is giving priority or giving some sort of points for equity and for inclusion. And so the livable grant or the TOD grant, can that include an equity agenda or equity points or inclusiveness? Those are the 2 things that I can think of from a council perspective. One of the other things too is I know the Met Council does oversee the Metro HRA, and that's where the Section 8 program is administered. Majority of the receivers of the Section 8 program happen to be people of color and communities of color and immigrant communities. And so how do you make that program more equitable, and how do you think of it from an innovative perspective? How do you make sure that the waiting list is 5-6 years? How do we get people out of that program and get them into home ownership? Is there ways that we can fund home ownership for those folks that are more on the cutting edge or are getting into that place where they have workforce availability and they have some funds or they can buy a house, but they may not quite be there. And so how do we think about equity in a different lens is some of the things that I would love to ask for the Met Council to think about and add that to the 2050 plan.
So Chair Wolf, I wanted to have plenty of time for conversation and want to know how you want to structure that. There's been a lot of information kind of provided to you. Does anybody have any thoughts, follow-up questions?
Yes, this is Gerald Bruner.
Hey, Jerry.
Yes.
Trista had said in the chat that she wanted to ask a question first. So I'm going to let Trista go first, and then Jerry, you can be after that if it's okay.
Do I have a choice?
No, not really.
Okay, it's fine.
Go ahead, Trista.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Wolf. I appreciate it. I just first wanted to say thank you incredibly to the entire panel. I'm like on the edge of my seat and so excited to hear from so many like-minded individuals and thinking about how we get to the solution of affordable housing in particular. As a Ramsey County Commissioner and chair of the HRA, we have like completely pulled the rug out, thrown it out, and try to figure out all the new tools that we can possibly do to get into building and creating more affordable housing. And for us, it isn't just about housing, it really is about the equity component because we are the most racially diverse county in the state of Minnesota. And so this is so exciting to hear. I'm wondering from the panel is, you know, are there any like quicker solutions that, like, if we just did this one thing, it would make it all easier? I'm hearing about applications, I'm hearing about fees, and you know, we have so few resources. We're trying to figure out is how do we keep stretching it without breaking ourselves? And so to think about, like, is it a change in application? Is it a points process? How do we do that on the local level? And then how do we get the Met Council to follow on so that they're following the same systems? Because, you know, at the rate we're going right now, it's going to take 47 years to meet the housing need just in Ramsey County alone, and that's unacceptable. So we have to figure out how do we expedite this in a way that we can do it.
Colleen?
Can I? Yeah. So I think I have some thoughts after listening to Noel and had some thoughts from before, and I think they also addressed Trista's question a little bit. So let me see if that works. I think there's a number of things that can help developers, and Noel talked about how hard it is for small developers. I'm one of those, and I'm older, but I'm still small. and what's required is that we take a lot of risk. And so, but there's a lot of risk in this, and it isn't any better for Cecile to take a lot of risk either. If we could make the process more streamlined and eliminate some of the risk, we would end up with better projects, I think, and make it easier for more people to get into this business. When you think about what Noel said about 3 years to get a project built, that's a long time. And the way that it works is we developers put our money into the project for all that time, and then at the end we get paid. So if you have to put up hundreds of thousands of dollars to get a project going, and you have to wait 3 years to get paid, that's a disincentive for sure for small businesses. So if we really want to encourage small businesses, we have to figure out how to shorten up that timeline and to make it less risky, so that if you do happen to put up a couple $100,000 to get a project going, you feel like you have a pretty good chance of recovering it, because that's not a risk that every small business can take. So speeding up the timeline would be a huge thing, and some of that has to do with some of the 3 year thing has to do with the timing of different funding. So if you miss this one, you got to wait till next year, and that adds a whole bunch of time to a project. So one of the ways to look at it would be, what are the ways to take some of the time constraints out of this thing, and getting the funding to be a little more flexible might be one of those ways. So another thing that Cecile was talking about was NIMBYs, and the idea that we could be working really hard on a project and putting hundreds of thousands of dollars in and not really know if it's going to get approved. That's another risk. That's a very hard risk for small developers to take, probably a hard risk for Common Bond to take. So that's another place where we could eliminate some of the obstacles and make it easier to do this. As I keep referring to this idea of a couple $100,000, I throw that number out kind of casually. It could be more than that, like to get a bigger project going, it's probably more like $500,000. Now, if you're going to gamble $500,000 of your money, you have to know that there's a pretty good chance you're going to get it done. And so if we want people to step up and take the risk of doing these projects, we have to really view them as community assets, the people that are doing the work, and how do we support that? And so I think there are a lot of ways to support small developers that have to do some of it with helping with some of that upfront cash, some with removing obstacles related to timing, and some removing obstacles related to questions about whether a city is going to stand up and support a project. And then the last thing I want to say on this topic is I feel like one of the things that we could really do that would change the dynamic of the discussion about NIMBYism is if we were doing more mixed income projects, where instead of talking about 100% affordable projects, we were talking about mixed income, and that all projects everywhere had an element of affordability to them. And then there's not quite as much trouble with the neighborhood opposition. That was a lot, sorry.
Thank you.
And I could just add on to that for a second. I think that one of the challenges that we've seen, we have a project, Gateway Northeast, which is on Lowry and Marshall in Northeast Minneapolis. It's over 100 units, underground parking, it's mixed income, it's market and Section 8. We had one investor that would look at the deal because they viewed it as too risky to have that mixed income. So it's really good. There's this weird perception of risk. And we don't have to go into where that comes from exactly. And I just wanted to put an exclamation point on this whole risk thing. So Common Bond, because we're larger, we've been able to create our own working capital fund. And so we go out and get PRIs, something related investment. Oh, what is it?
Program-related investments.
Thank you. Program-related investments, or a line of credit from a bank, and that's because we have this balance sheet. We still got to pay that money back. So if we've got $500,000, which is more like it, 500, but this last year we had $900,000 out the door. That because sometimes you can negotiate with their architects to get paid at closing. Sometimes you can't. And if those projects don't close for whatever reason, but the city, the Met Council, Minnesota Housing is requiring 75% plans and specifications. I'm making that up because I don't have to do that detail work. That costs a lot of money to do. So it's a risk that we think about. You can imagine small developers who may not have that balance sheet to go get those resources and what that risk is. And I would imagine for small developers, a lot of those are personal guarantees. That's not the case at a Common Bond. I'm not personally guaranteeing anything. So this risk question is a really important one to consider. I'm not sure what the Met Council's role in all that is. Although when I was asking my folks on my team if they had any suggestions, one of them did say, they're going to figure out how to get some free pre-development dollars to small minority-owned developers if we really want to open up those opportunities because of that risk.
I wanted to add a couple of things to that too. One is I wanted to shift the lens to the Met Council or any public agency funding a project that's affordable housing project has inclusion goals for women and minority business owners to be included into the project. Oftentimes, those public projects also have bonding rules around it. Most small minority-owned businesses don't have and cannot afford bonding because that requires what Cecil said was personal guarantees. And every $100,000 bond, for example, requires that you have $10,000 in the bank, liquid assets. Very few people can have that much cash in there. And so talk about equity, if you have inclusion goals in a project and you want women and minority-owned businesses to be part of those projects and building them and earning, ability to create wealth and to be part of this and maybe become developers one day. Imagine you just created another barrier for them to be part of that project. And so what happens is typically those projects will say, we've tried, but we can't find. And so good faith effort, we're good to go. We're not going to include them. And they will just achieve the minimum inclusion, not necessarily the maximum. And so one of the things for Met Council to think about is, if you're going to require bonding, how do we make that barrier easier? And bonding is great because it helps with the risk at the end of the day, but can you create a capital fund that helps with bonding? That would be one thing. I have never built Met Council project ever, and I don't intend to for the next few, and I built $15 million projects for Target, and there is no bonding requirement for a Target project. Just think about that.
That's helpful to know. Jerry, you have been very patient.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I've got a couple of questions for the panel. Anybody can answer it for me. One, my experience with government projects, it seems like they spend 20% of their budget on engineering, consultants, architects, all kinds of things. So 20% off the top seems to me is an awful high figure. So one of my questions is, Colleen, Better, Noel, or Sam, what percent do you spend on projects before even one shovel of dirt is moved? And two, do you think there's inefficiency with having so many different entities or agencies trying to accomplish the same thing? Wouldn't it be better to have less, so maybe funding form or anything would be a little bit easier to get? Thank you. I'll wait for my answer.
I can speak to the architectural and engineering part of things, but I don't know exactly what you're referring to when you talk about 20%. Our architectural fees on our projects are typically about 4% of the construction costs, and then there's some engineering stuff on top of that, but it's nothing like 20%. We certainly could have 20% spent before we get a shovel in the ground, because that is sometimes what it takes to get a project going. So when you said you might have 20% spent before you get a shovel in the ground, yeah, that's true. That could be true on a complicated project, but it wouldn't all be architectural and engineering. For a typical development projects, you'd have spent some money on architecture, you'd have spent some money on soil studies and environmental reports, and you'd have put some money down on your land, so you have a purchase agreement and you have some earnest money down, and you have had a market study done. And so there's a variety of costs that are involved in getting a project ready to be, breaking ground. And so it is a big number, but it isn't all architectural and engineering. It's a lot of different categories.
Well, yes, I didn't want to name them all, but it just seems like projects spend 20% of the allotted budget. They go before even a shovel of dirt is moved. So, one, is that the four people there? What percent do you spend on projects? And two, do you think companies charge more for government projects than they would for private enterprise projects?
I could say just a couple things. I don't have those numbers in front of me, but if you think about it, the entire development budget of legal fees, architectural fees, financing fees, legal fees related to creating partnerships, an appraisal, a survey, whatever those things are, it's quite extensive. The only thing that's left to pay when you put the shovel in the ground is the construction.
Yeah.
So if you think about it, if it is 20%, I don't know if that's true, that does make sense because 80% is to actually build the building. And a lot of these requirements we may want to do for risk, but the majority of this stuff is all required by your lenders, whether that's a bank or it's the Met Council or it's the City of St. Paul or it's Minnesota Housing. So that's just kind of a broad general thing. I think in terms of whether or not it costs more, I think it depends. You know, so for example, some sources require prevailing wage, which can sometimes be more than union. And there's a lot of private developers who won't necessarily use union. And there are some general contractors out there that are going to charge less and that we would never work with because we know how they do this. We know how they build and they don't do a good job. That whole thing, if you get what you pay for, is really true. There's an article in the paper recently, and I was personally familiar with this, about the whole labor, I can't remember the phrase, but essentially where a general contractor is getting a lot of Latino folks, housing them, and not paying them prevailing wage, saying, I'm going to make sure you get deported, or I'm going to do something else to you if you don't say wage theft. Thank you very much. It was wage theft. And that's a real thing. And there's somebody who's just being convicted of that right now. And that's a real thing that's happening. And I was just appalled by that, but it is happening. Somebody was actually killed. So this is, you know, that's, and I think your costs also, some of our costs get driven by the requirements of our Minnesota Housing, for example, and cities. If cities require a certain, if Met Council wants to see water infiltration a certain way, well, that costs money. If you want to have structured parking, like below grade, so you have more green space, well, what is that, Colleen? Like $25,000 or $30,000 per stall to build underground. Somebody's got to pay for that. So everything that any funder requires, you just have to know it costs money to do it if it's out of the ordinary. And then in addition, for organizations like ours, we're only going to build 3 or 4 stories because we can't afford to switch into a new construction type. So it's lots of variables.
We have a question in the chat from Swado. NIMBYism was briefly mentioned. My question is on land use challenges to building in suburban communities, specifically on affordable housing.
Well, there certainly are challenges. I think I think there are cities that have figured this out and have and to my way of thinking, the way for cities to do it is to make a plan before they're talking about a specific project and getting into a fight with somebody and really focus on what are our goals, what are our kind of high level objectives about what we're trying to accomplish in our city, and then really setting the table for development to happen so that they get the kind of developers they want, they get and the developers that come there are prepared for what to meet the city's goals. I am a developer who thinks cities should have high standards and not have the bar be too low for what you're looking for. But cities also have to be realistic and understand what's happening in the market. And working with developers that you trust helps a lot, but having a sense of having done the work internally about what are we trying to accomplish as it relates to our housing goals and what are we the city willing to do to make that happen, I think goes a long way to helping a community understand what the city wants to do about affordable housing before it comes down to a particular site.
I guess I'm going to add in on that quick, take my prerogative as chair, even though I'm not a panelist. In Lakeville, when I first started on the Planning Commission 25 years ago, there was a lot of concern about affordable housing developments. But the county CDA, who was usually the developer, had a good track record of running their properties well, maintaining them well, and fitting into the community well. And so as that track record got longer, you could point to more places where this is working fine. Don't freak out. These are good neighbors, and good properties. And looking at them, you can't tell that they're affordable housing. They just look like housing. That went a long way to eliminating the NIMBY issue, and that it really doesn't come up that much anymore, does it, Carl?
Thank you, Chair. I think the big challenge is we recently had a project that was just a multifamily project. It wasn't even affordable, and it was in a commercial area. And we spent a year looking at ordinances to come up with an ordinance that would work, included the council, included the neighborhood. And when it hit council the first time, it got tabled. And yet the council had voted on all these requirements, our council. And the developer worked really hard to try and meet the desires of 3 neighbors is what it boiled down to, the 3 that shared a property line. And it ultimately did get approved, but they lowered the height of the building. And I mean, they did a lot of stuff that they really weren't required to do based on the ordinance that was written and the work that was done, quite frankly, with the neighborhood. So even when you do all those kind of things, and this wasn't even affordable. This was a market rate project, but there's that belief that those people in apartments are different than us people in single family homes. We struggle with that a little bit, and there's some biases that take place, when property is being developed.
And Chair?
Go ahead, Dan.
Okay, I was just going to say, from our perspective, we did make sure that we, in our last round of the comprehensive plan update, were really thoughtful about locations that made sense for more density, for the possibility of affordable housing, and partly because the Met Council asked us to, but partly because that's the issue we ran into with Common Bonds project in our city most recently, was that it was a single family zone property that we had to rezone for multifamily. And that was the point, because we require rezoning applications to get a lot of community input before they go forward. That was where the NIMBY attitude started entering into the process. And so the more you can have properties that are properly zoned, that you already have the thoughtful standards for heights and densities and setbacks and all those other things in place and available. And what we've done a lot of too is putting in, mixed use type zoning throughout the city, which means that sometimes it can be commercial, sometimes it can be multifamily, it could be a combination of the two. All of that is put in place ahead of time to make it easier for the flexibility that developers especially are going to be looking for going forward. But also because then you're not in a situation, and I'm glad we were able to make it work with Common Bond, but the worst thing is when you're seeking to rezone a property to do a project like this, that's where the NIMBY issues start to step in. And so the more cities can do to be proactive in setting up the framework to make it work well ahead of time, the better it's going to work, from my perspective. And I'm glad actually that the Met Council in this last go around of the comp plan really was pushing cities to think in that regard. But I still think a lot of cities, especially in suburban communities, aren't being as forward thinking in that regard and as proactive in their zoning decisions and planning. So just wanted to make sure and get that out there.
Madam Chair?
Go ahead.
Thanks. Thanks, Mayor. I think that's a really good point, and what I wanted to an exclamation point on is the flexibility. Because if a city, for example, says high density multifamily housing can only go in this area, well, if there's no land over there, or if the land is too expensive and you can't buy it, it's not going to happen. And that maybe a site was zoned multifamily or residential, but like in that, for example, in that case, from my perspective, it's on a corner of Rice Street. Most developers aren't going to come in today and put single family on that corner because the other 3 corners were commercial. But it forces the city council to make a decision, and it gives ammunition to folks who were concerned about NIMBY. And remember, this was for a senior project. This was not formerly homeless vets. This was seniors. In addition, you might have everything just perfect, but if there's even one variance that has to happen, that's got to go most likely through both Planning Commission and the City Council, which was the case on another deal that we were working on. And the parking requirements had nothing to do with the reality of affordable housing. You know, we run 8,000 units. We know how much parking we need. This was like double that. It was like over 2 cars per unit. And that just doesn't happen in affordable housing. So, but you need to get a variance for that. So it might be very reasonable request, but you got all these people, all these neighbors who say, this is what they can use to not make that happen. So for example, at that project, we are sitting there, it was 2 4-hour meetings, and at the City Council, it was 2-2, and you could hear a pin drop. And that City Council doesn't sound like a lot, but sat there for about 3 minutes, silence. And nobody knew what was going to happen. It's just incredibly nerve-wracking. And then unfortunately, you have constituents leaving. We were successful, but then you have constituents leaving who are really upset. And that doesn't feel good for us because we want to have happy neighbors. And it certainly doesn't feel good to the council members. So to the extent that you can encourage cities to have as much flexibility as possible so that you don't necessarily need a vote, you know, that there's some, I'm just making this up, but some administrative authority that a city manager could do. And then we would have the option of going to the council. Just thinking about that creatively, that would provide some flexibility, but still guiding, so that the city isn't, you know, it's not whack-a-mole where things are going, but I think flexibility is really key. I'll stop now.
Wendy?
Kathy.
You know, we did something that was interesting. We asked the developer to bring in the management company, and the council wanted to interview that management company. We know which management companies are lax and how those apartments quickly deteriorate because of bad management. When we started doing that and the public would come in and we allowed them to help us question the management company and their principles and show us what you've done and show us some successful, that's been really, really helpful getting past this NIMBY thing.
Yeah, I think that's right. We, for example, I remember one developer, I think it was out in Minnetonka, wanted to do a high density multifamily, and the neighbors went ballistic around the density. So he rented a bus and he put everybody on the bus and showed them a property. He said, that's what I'm talking about. I said, oh, okay. So we use some language around density that people can't really visualize. So to the extent that any developer can let somebody kick the tires, which I think is the same thing in terms of interviewing property managers, I think really helps people understand what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Noel, did you have something to say?
I was just going to say, I agree with Cecil, but Colleen said something really important, which is cities need to have standards. And I'm a true believer of that. I also think that it's important that affordable housing doesn't happen on its own, that there's mixed use and that there's no concentration of poverty in certain neighborhoods and certain areas. Sometimes affordable housing happens to be the only property that's available in that area, and it's structured in a place where there's, Cecil was talking about Rice Street. I mean, that's a high traffic, high commercial. It doesn't really make sense, and it doesn't make sense for long term. The other thing too to think about is, what do we want for our cities to look like 20, 30, 40 years from now? We have all these market rate projects that are 200, 300 complexes that are just massive. And COVID kind of makes you think, do we want to still live in 300 square feet with no access to green space? And how far are we from all of these things that we need, our grocery store, a park, all of these things. And so what do we want for our cities to think, to look like? How do we want to work? How do we want to live? How do we want to play? We can't go to the gym. Can we go run? Is there access to place that you can run and walk. I mean, those are some of the things that would be really important. If you go to Europe, in probably 4 or 5 blocks, you can access a shop, you can access a grocery store, you can access your school, you can access a park. And our cities are not growing that way. If I live in Lakeville, I have to go and drive to my grocery store. It's usually not a walkable distance. And typically there's no place for me to bike either, or to take my kids and just walk with them. And so how we think about our cities is really something that's really important. And I hope COVID kind of makes people think about how we design our cities. The other thing too is that a lot of seniors live in, especially low-income seniors live in apartments that are stacked, and typically they don't have any access. So one of the examples is Horn Towers. You got 20 stories. They don't usually speak English. Think about isolation and COVID, and how has that impacted these communities of color and all seniors. And so what does that mean for senior housing going forward? Especially affordable housing, affordable senior housing. And how do we create communities? How do we make sure that we think about health? We're gonna have another pandemic. That one is for sure. It may not happen for the next 10 years. It may not happen 20 years from now. It may happen 30 years from now. How do we build our buildings? How do we think about heat and ventilation? How do we think about desanitation? How do we think about access to transportation? I mean, all of that is going to be something we have to think about from development standpoint.
I have a question.
Who was that? I couldn't tell from your voice.
It's April Graves.
Oh, go ahead, April.
Yeah, I really appreciate this conversation, and I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Opportunity site in Brooklyn Center that we've been working to redevelop for quite some time. Actually, the original kind of planning started long before I was even on the council, so more than 6 years ago, maybe even more than 10 years ago. More recently, we've had some interest from a specific developer, and over like the last year and a half, we've been working to create a drafted master plan, which included a ton of community engagement that the city, I don't think, had ever really been that intentional about in the past. That being said, there has been some community members who have been engaged with the process who don't really identify anything specific about the drafted master plan that they don't like, but just haven't felt as though the engagement has been inclusive enough. And now this drafted master plan includes considerations like access to transportation, green space, mixed use, so both businesses and homes, and also thinking about including affordable units as well as market rate units. And most of you probably know that Brooklyn Center is actually really full of affordable housing. A lot of it is naturally occurring. So we want to diversify our options so that people who want to stay in the city and might have been able to climb the economic ladder have some other options. And there isn't that many currently in Brooklyn Center. That being said, we also know that the need for real affordable housing is still ever present. So I guess my frustration right now is trying to get the community to really evaluate the drafted master plan and let us know what's missing. I mean, we're developing a community benefits agreement, but there still seems to be some voices, and it's not NIMBY voices, although there are a few of those, that don't want us to move forward with the plan, even though I feel like it's pretty representative of what I would guess the community would say. And we've included, organizations to help us in this work that are representative of the cultural communities within the city. Nonetheless, I'm finding it really difficult to try to get the community members that are most engaged, as well as some of my fellow council members, to really feel as though the master plan is good enough. So there's a push kind of to do even more community engagement. And I said, well, community engagement should happen throughout the planning process and into implementation. But I don't know. I just wondered if maybe some of our panelists have any tips for me or an assessment tool for the master plan, because I think one of the biggest issues really is just a lack of trust towards developers, and that it will really be of benefit to the community, despite this master plan that I think speaks to those concerns.
Chair, if I may, the Land Institute does have, this type of a forum where we just in general talk about what it takes to do development with a team of panelists. But we also have something more detailed called the Technical Assistance Panel that could evaluate the master plan and how that plan might work in reality. Like what would it actually take to attract a developer, and doing that with the community or with the council or with the property owner, or however it might be structured. So that could be one option. And we're constantly looking at different ways how to do that, and how to engage people in a different way. We are working within the Rondo community and right now looking at a completely different way of doing this. So I agree. I think it's tough. It's tough to get people to come out and talk about what they might aspire to or want before the development actually is in front of them. But that's really important so that when the development comes in, it doesn't hit all these roadblocks. So I'd be happy to talk to you offline about that opportunity, or your staff. Just let me know.
I will say Ryan Companies did one of the most extraordinary jobs of community engagement for the Ford site that I've ever seen. To the extent that when there were amendments that were going to take place to the master plan and they went to the planning commission, it was standing room only, and there wasn't one community member who spoke against it. I was sitting in the back with another former city member and our jaws just dropped. And it would be an interesting conversation. I won't take up this time here, but to just have a conversation with what they did and how they did it. Because it was very personable. It was very St. Paul centric, but it was masterful. And it is a skill to get people out of their fear, like acknowledging their fears and then figuring out how you mitigate that, for lack of a better word, for them. But I will say, to the point of the development once the plan is done, one of the reasons that both PPL and Common Bond pushed really hard to get our first projects done right now was to ride the momentum of neighborhood approval, because the players are going to change. The neighbors are going to change, and that support may go away. But anyway, Ryan, it would be a really interesting conversation about how they did it.
Do we have any other questions? I'm going to forego our information item number 2 for today because we're having a great conversation. I don't want to cut it short. And staff knew that might happen, so I'm going to let that happen. But do any other LUAC members have questions? If nobody from the membership has questions, I have a question that I would like the panelists to answer, and that is, what do you wish that land use decision makers do that's obvious to you but might not be obvious to them?
Specifically around land use?
No, it doesn't have to be around, as you're going through the development process with cities who've come up with their land use plan, is there something that doesn't make any sense to you that if you could tell them, the world doesn't work that way? It maybe works that way on a map, but it doesn't work that way in real life. Anything like that's obvious to you but might not be obvious to decision makers.
You gonna go, Colleen?
I can try. I think I would go back to the risk part of the equation. I have been doing this a long time, and I feel like cities and land use planners don't necessarily understand the risk that developers are required to go through to get a project done. And I recognize that there are a lot of developers who who haven't earned cities and planners' trust, and that we don't have the reputation that like we're down there with used car sales people, but in fact there are a lot of really fine developers who are completely committed to the same kinds of things that cities are committed to, and would love to work in partnership with cities to make those kinds of things happen. And so I always try to be transparent with the projects and the cities that I'm working with, and build trust. And so, but I think it'd be helpful if people would understand what it actually takes for us to get these darn things done, with 10, 15 sources of financing and long drawn out schedules and lots of ups and downs and opportunities for it to be not successful or really hard to do. And I admit that there are developers who don't honor the kind of commitments that I think we make to cities when we do work there. But I would love it if people could really understand what it takes to get it done from our side.
I feel like I've been talking a lot, but I'll just add a couple things. I think streamlining a process, to have 5 meetings around a zoning change is just, again, it just takes a lot of time. It drags that out. Parking, to have the parking to kind of have the developer present data. It's real data, not anecdotal, about what's really needed. And then I think any other requirements that might be required to be reasonable in terms of cost in the marketplace. I agree with Noel and Colleen that there should be standards, because you want to have stuff that's additive, that's viewed as an asset that people drive by, and that's a really nice looking building. So there's balances to be achieved in that. So those are just a couple of things.
Sam, you've been super quiet.
Quiet. Everybody's been doing a very good job of answering questions. I mean, to answer this question though, it's what's always struck me is the best intentioned land use plan. It's fun to create. You say, the transit line is going to go here, and there's going to be beautiful apartments and a park and a store. It doesn't take into account the control of property, and you can't control who's going to buy the next parcel of land or the building to redevelop 10 years from now. That's up off to the private market. So the way to just start to control that is housing trusts and that sort of thing. But that's always kind of like the wild card, because it may very well be a developer who simply wants to develop something and make their money in 5 years and sell it, and that's all they care about. So that's the real world. So that's where good land use regulations come in, and quality zoning code and all that stuff is really important.
I would just add 2 things. One of the things that we're doing that Met Council is supporting for us to do is we're putting together a developers pro forma workshop. The target audience is city staff, and with the hope that once we do the first cohort with the city staff, that we would be able to condense it to be able to do it for policy leaders. And in the hopes that that will give a little bit more detail about the risk, about what it takes to actually put these developments together, to equip the staff with the ability to support these projects because they have the knowledge and the understanding about it. So we're going to be unrolling that in the next few weeks, and I'm really excited about that. The other thing that we're trying to shift, just like we tried to shift affordable housing with the importance of a full range of housing choices, we're trying to shift how communities feel that they put money into a deal. It's not a subsidy, it's their investment in the future. And so, language matters. And the part about this language mattering is that a community should feel that when they're putting money into a deal, that that's their investment in the future success of that deal. So we're kind of hoping to do our work in that way, where we give communities the confidence that any investment into a project is that. It is that. It's just that. It's an investment in their future.
Thank you. Trista, you have a question?
Yeah, I want to just ask a follow-up question. We've talked a lot about risk. Over the last year since the pandemic, uncertainty about the economy, we had heard from nonprofit developers that they were struggling to get some of the funding kind of synced in because banks were now requiring more collateral to get a loan and to do developments. So one of the things I was considering, and forgive my language and my elementary knowledge of finances, but Ramsey County, we have a really great credit rating. And I said, well, can't we just co-sign a loan similar to like my parents did when I bought my first car, right? Like to say like, because we don't have a lot of money to put on the table necessarily for our project, but we have an incredible credit rating. And so is there a way that we can work with nonprofit developers to say, we're willing to put our assets on the line because we believe in this project, we believe in what will come, without having to necessarily put the whole dollar amount. And so I don't know if that's just a crazy idea or if it's something worth fleshing out, but just wanted to get kind of the panel's thoughts on that.
One of the things I think you're talking about could be like letters of credit. That's, a lot of, you can do a letter of credit or cash in lieu of a letter of credit. That might be beneficial to sponsor. That might unleash some capital. So I'm not sure how the city could co-sign or a county could co-sign. It'd be great, but that risk seems probably a little much. But if there were a fund that a developer could access to get a letter of credit, and there were kind of at least some minimum requirements, because the city also has to watch its risk, or the county has to watch its risk. Maybe there's a way to do that creatively, to think about what would be a palatable risk for the taxpayer dollars while also achieving needs.
I was especially thinking of like how we talked about like new developers or developers of color, women developers, how they don't have a lot, to be able to put up front to do a project. And so to think about how can we do that creatively, and it's okay if you tell me it's a bad idea too. I have thick skin.
One of the things that helped me to get my business going was that GMIC, Greater Metropolitan Housing Corporation, provided pre-development loans. And I haven't asked them for one lately, so I don't know exactly. They don't have them anymore. Cecile's shaking her head no. Yeah, so that was really critical, and it was important money that was available to a developer to help get a project done that had certain criteria. It wasn't just any old thing, but it made a gigantic difference to have access to pre-development capital. So to the extent that you could kind of fine-tune that fund idea in a way that it could be available for pre-development capital. What happened is that GMIC would give you money and you would use it to pay the architects and get all the pieces in place. And then when you got to a closing, you paid them back, and they earned an interest rate on it. So, and in fact, I think they borrowed the money from somebody else at a little less interest. So I think that was a really good model that helped me as a beginning developer to be able to get started.
And I just have to say, it was great. It was a one-page demand note. The process was simple. It was practically a phone call. It was not onerous at all. So LISC, Local Initiative Support Corporation, also has that. I think it's a $50,000 max. I think it's a 12-page contract you sign. It's just much more, because they're a national organization. GMIC was our region. So to the extent that that kind of a fund could happen, it kind of goes to what Noel was talking about, is that how do you get those costs paid for? And to understand, you got to have a risk tolerance. Like, how much of that are you going to be willing to write off? Because you're going to have to write some of it off because they don't all come through. That'd be great.
Yeah, I mean, Cecil and Colleen both said it. Gimmick is not, doesn't have the funds anymore, and it's a big loss for the community. But I would say, Trista, there is no bad idea. I think the fact that you're thinking outside of the box is so amazing. One of the things that I'd love to suggest, and I think this might be a possibility, is that you could potentially have counties can sometimes go to the legislature and get a bond, and you could create a set-aside program for something like this. And you could create a fund, or you could make it a pre-development grant. You could make it into, and there are a lot of funders, both for-profit and nonprofit, that would potentially invest in that. And then the other thing is, don't underestimate, almost every public entity has investment dollars. I'm not in the finance committee for the state of Minnesota, but every city and every state and every county has investment dollars, and those are pension funds, and typically they are in the public sector. They're invested in the stock market. And so if you think about it, investments could be made into the development world. And frankly, where the stock market is today, as of this morning, I know it's going to go down. And so your money is probably a lot less risky asset would be to invest it in a real estate asset that's local.
Thanks. I see that Dan Rowe says in the chat, Met Council has limited funding for affordable housing. Maybe a better use is that type of pre-development loan program. And Tara Beard is on this WebEx meeting, so I'm sure she's taking furious notes, and perhaps at some point in the future the council will discuss something like that, because we do various grants for pre-development planning, having community meetings and coming up with plans and stuff, but maybe that is something that the council should be talking about as well for some of our livable communities grants. And I see she just took off or turned on her camera. Did you want to say something, Tara?
Thank you, Councilmember Wolf. I mean, just you read my mind. Yep, I've been taking notes, really appreciating a lot of this feedback. We are going to be recommending double the amount of pre-development funds for 2021 than we've ever provided in the past, in recognition of this similar feedback, and want to work really hard to understand how the pre-development funds can do more to help kind of change the landscape a bit in the ways you all have been discussing. So thanks so much.
Thank you. And we are coming to the end of our time. We have 1 minute left of our meeting time. I want to thank all of our panelists for the presentation today and sharing your knowledge with us, and the LUAC members for asking thoughtful questions. Thank you for being here today and letting us pick your brain.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, everyone. If I could just last say, if any of the communities out there are wanting to have this type of a workshop in their cities with their city council, just let me know. We have capacity to do more. Thank you to Met Council, and looking to get those on the calendar.
Great.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, LUAC members. It was great to be here.
Yeah, really appreciate the conversation. We're at your service if there's any information. So great when you get it from the folks who are actually doing the work. So really appreciate you asking.
Well, thank you. With it being at the end of our meeting time and no further business to come before the LUAC, I would adjourn the meeting. Thank you.